Okay, let's dive deep. Today we're taking a forensic look, really getting into an autopsy report about a very tragic death.
Mm-hmm. And this deep dive, it's built entirely from a source you provided, a transcript from KTN News Kenya. It details the post-mortem on the late Albert Ojwang.
Right. So our mission here is pretty focused. We want to unpack what the medical experts actually concluded, cut through any noise.
Exactly. What did the pathologists find? What did the science tell them about how he died, about the circumstances? We're sticking just to the facts presented in that transcript.
And we have to acknowledge this is a sensitive subject. There's a real human tragedy here.
Absolutely.
But our focus, like the source itself, is strictly on the factual information, the medical findings from the forensic team. We want to understand their objective process.
Definitely. And the source tells us this examination happened at the Nairobi funeral home. When the report was being given, the process was actually described as currently ongoing.
So, like, immediate information, really fresh.
Yeah, gives you that set. And this wasn't just one person's view. The source says it was a team effort.
A team, right. How many?
5 pathologists, actually. A team of 5.
Okay, 5 experts.
And led by Dr. Bernard Media, a forensic pathologist. Which is important, right? They specialize in interpreting injuries in, well, legal contexts.
And what really struck me from the source was how inclusive the process was.
Yeah.
It wasn't just doctors behind closed doors.
No, that's a key point they made. It suggests real transparency. The family was there, IPOA, human rights groups, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, the Independent Medical Legal Organization.
Wow, that's quite a list. So multiple eyes on the process.
A broad spectrum, yeah.
Yeah.
Representatives witnessing it all.
And this leads to something the source really hammers home. All 5 pathologists, all of them, including those representing different groups, they were in concurrence. They were in agreement about the findings.
And that is huge. You know, in situations like this, having every medical expert agree on the findings based on the body itself, that lends massive weight, serious credibility.
It suggests the evidence was just clear.
Clear enough for total consensus, yeah.
Okay, so solid process, clear agreement. Let's get to the findings then. What did Dr. Media and the team actually discover, according to the source?
Well, they detailed several critical things. First off, serious injuries to the head.
Head injuries. Okay, that's significant immediately.
Very. And alongside that, they found features of neck compression.
Neck compression, too. So head and neck, both incredibly vulnerable areas showing severe trauma. Was that it?
No, and this is where it gets even more telling. Beyond the head and neck, they found multiple soft tissue injuries. And the source stresses these weren't just in one spot. They were, quote, spread all over the body.
Spread all over. That paints a very different picture. Where exactly did they note these injuries?
The source lists them specifically. Head, neck, upper limbs, trunk, and lower limbs. So, yeah, a really widespread pattern. Systemic. Systemic. Okay. How did the pathologist read that? What did they conclude about how these happened?
Their conclusion was direct. They stated the injuries were externally inflicted from external source. And boiling it down, they said the injuries were in keeping with assault.
In keeping with assault. Wow, that's a strong medical interpretation of the physical evidence.
It is.
So putting it all together then, the head trauma, the neck compression, these widespread soft tissue injuries, what do they explicitly state as the cause of death?
Dr. Media said the cause of death was, his words, very clear, directly linked to all those findings. It was the combination, head injury, neck compression, and those other injuries, all pointing towards assault.
So the medical evidence, the state of the body itself, led the forensic team straight to the conclusion. Death caused by severe injuries from an assault.
That's what the science indicated, yes, plainly.
Okay. Now, an autopsy gives us a lot, but it's usually part of a bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
Did the source mention any further steps?
It did. Yeah, the examination wasn't the end point. The pathologist took samples from the body. Samples.
For forensic lab analysis. You know, toxicology, looking closer at tissues under a microscope, that sort of thing. It adds another scientific layer. And the source also mentioned other investigative agencies were invited to contribute, to potentially corroborate the findings.
Corroborate. So, like, cross-check with other evidence.
Exactly. See if other investigation methods line up with what the autopsy showed, building that comprehensive picture.
Now, the transcript touches on a really tough question that was put to the pathologist about the duration. how long the injuries might have been inflicted. The word torture was used. Could they tell?
Yeah, that was addressed. And the pathologist's answer, as reported, really highlights the limits of just the autopsy for pinpointing exact timing. They said it's arguable if the injuries were sequential, one after another over time.
Right.
Or all at once. Or within a shorter period, and dating them precisely.
Yeah.
Temporarily, as in times of space, was the phrase used. Basically putting them accurately on a timeline.
That sounds tricky.
Very tricky. Just from the gross examination, they could only offer a pretty broad time frame. Could have been within a short time, maybe the same day, maybe 1 day, 2 days, even several days before death.
So they knew the what and the likely how, the assault.
Yeah.
But the precise when or duration was harder to fix just from the body.
Exactly. That often needs more context, more information combined.
Okay. Which brings us to maybe one of the most striking parts of this source.
Yeah.
Where the pathologist directly addresses a different story that was apparently out there. The source says the police gave some unreasonable reason that Ojwang died from hitting his head on a wall. How did the autopsy findings square with that?
Well, they didn't square at all. This is where the objective medical findings really push back hard against that narrative. The pathologist was clear in dismissing it.
And not just dismissing it, but explaining why, medically, right? Based on what they actually saw.
Yeah, precisely. They explain the kind of injury pattern you'd expect from hitting a head on something blunt and flat, like a wall. Usually that causes a specific, localized injury. They mention a frontal bleed.
Frontal bleed. So impact at the front, bleeding mainly at the front.
That's the typical expectation, yes. But what they found in the autopsy, totally different. They found bleeds, hematomas, under the scalp. But they were, quote, partially spread on all aspects.
All aspects, not just the front.
Exactly. The source says this included the face, the sides of the head, even the back of the head. Widespread trauma on the head.
Okay, so trauma all around the head. How does that, plus the injuries everywhere else on the body, argue against hitting a wall or self-inflicted injury?
Well, the pathologist made that connection explicit. This widespread head trauma combined with all those other widespread soft tissue injuries on the limbs, the trunk.
Okay.
That combination, their expert conclusion was, it's unlikely to be self-inflicted injury.
Unlikely self-inflicted. That's a critical medical judgment.
It really is. And they reinforced it, saying the bleeding patterns they saw were not synonymous with self-infliction. What they observed just didn't fit the picture of someone causing those injuries to themselves by hitting a wall or any other way.
So the physical evidence painted a picture completely at odds with that simple explanation.
Fundamentally different. The pattern, the severity, the distribution. Medically inconsistent with that narrative of, like, a single self-inflicted impact.
Did they mention anything else, any other specific signs pointing to what happened? The source mentioned something about a struggle.
Yes. The pathologist did note finding signs of struggle within the injuries. They mentioned more detail was in the full report, but, not for general consumption at that point.
Right. Understandable. Some details are just for the investigation.
Likely, yes.
Okay, so let's pull it all together. Severe head and neck trauma, widespread injuries all over, patterns that don't match self-infliction, signs of a struggle. What was the final overarching conclusion from the pathologists based on this source?
Based on everything they found, the medical evidence, their overall conclusion was pretty stark. There was some foul play.
Foul play.
And directly addressing the idea of suicide or self-harm, they stated quite unequivocally, Albert Ojwang didn't take his life.
Didn't take his life. That's about as direct as it gets from a forensic team based purely on the physical evidence.
Rooted right in what they observed on the body.
And just circling back to that transparency point, the source also mentioned the family's reaction.
It did. It reported the family was satisfied and, importantly, also in full concurrence with the findings presented by the pathologists.
Which reinforces that agreement from everyone present, right?
Exactly. Adds another layer confirming the consensus around the medical facts.
So this deep dive, just based on this KTN News transcript you provided, it really shows how forensic pathology can cut through confusion. The autopsy, according to the source, found severe, externally inflicted injuries all over Albert Ojwang's body, head, neck, everywhere. Findings consistent with assault, and really crucially, findings that directly contradicted that other narrative about hitting a wall.
It really underscores how powerful that expert medical examination is, letting the physical evidence speak, providing a factual foundation straight from the body itself.
And for you listening, who gave us this source, hopefully this deep dive gives you that clear, fact-based picture directly from the pathologists involved.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, how findings like these initial conclusions from the autopsy based purely on the physical evidence, how they must shape or maybe even redirect the entire investigation that comes next. How this kind of expert evidence shifts the understanding compared to, say, initial reports.